On the 21st of February 2025 at 9:58 a.m., Air Services Australia received a warning from a commercial airline pilot that Chinese warships were undertaking live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea, 300 nautical miles or about 550 kilometres east of Sydney. Within 2 minutes, air traffic controllers had warned all aircraft operating in the area and ultimately diverted 49 flights on the busy Australia-New Zealand flight corridor. Nobody was hurt, but this incident, along with a second exercise the next day, became a major talking point in Australia and New Zealand. Focus only intensified when a second live fire exercise took place the next day, and then stepped up again when it became clear that this Chinese task force, which Defence had been tracking for days at that point, intended to circumnavigate Australia. The presence of the task force, far from a common sight in Australia's remote waters, only heightened the sense of geopolitical nervousness which Australians were feeling as we watched the Euro-Atlantic geopolitical order being upended by Donald Trump and his reprehensible treatment of stalwart American friends like Canada, his haranguing and abandonment of Ukraine when they refused to sign over $500 billion worth of minerals to him, and his general closeness with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. With an election looming, Australia's opposition leader, Peter Dutton, always keen to push his national security credentials, announced on the 2nd of March that, under a Liberal government, Australia would acquire an additional 28 F-35As for $3 billion. But this announcement was widely panned in Australia by numerous commentators, and personally I can completely understand why. Let's leave aside the fact that $3 billion doesn't actually cover the cost of buying 28 F-35As. At an average flyaway price of 82.5 million US, with current exchange rates, it would actually cost around 3.7 billion Aussie just to buy the planes. Let's also leave aside that no money seems to have been allocated for maintenance, personnel, or actually flying these jets, the operating cost for which would be higher than the Super Hornets that they're presumably replacing. Let's even leave aside the fact that the opposition leader announced this policy in response to a naval circumnavigation, and while the F-35A is in many ways an amazing aircraft, swapping out the RAAF Super Hornets with the F-35 would take Australia's premier maritime strike asset and replace it with a fighter much less optimised for anti-shipping missions, one which isn't even integrated with the LRASM yet. But even with all that ignored, the most damning issue with the Liberals' plan remains. According to their own press release, their plan would see additional aircraft begin delivery within 5 years. That is to say, we wouldn't expect to even see our first aircraft until 2030 at the earliest. Given that both sides of politics keep telling us that we're in a period of enormous strategic risk, that our strategic warning time is gone, and that we're facing a threat from China to Taiwan as soon as 2027, delivery of exquisite, expensive, low-density assets in 2030 doesn't really seem to be what the ADF needs right now in 2025. So, with that election I mentioned earlier still very much on the way, I couldn't help but wonder if Anthony Albanese will feel the need to match Dutton's $3 billion boost to the defence budget. And in fact, as I record this about a week out from budget night, reports are suggesting that we will see increased defence spending in the upcoming budget. So, if that new spending does kick off something of a car key election, then I think that there are far more important things we could prioritise, things that will see capability delivered or improved much quicker and fill gaps that exist right now. In fact, I came up with 10 better ways to spend $3 billion, and I thought I would offer some rough outlines of those ideas right here. Not all of the ideas will necessarily cost the full $3 billion. Many will cost less, and a few will probably cost a bit more. Some are practically straightforward and could be pulled off more or less right away, often with basic civilian contractors. Others will need more prep time and honestly might be more in the realm of wish casting than any kind of realistic expectation of actual action from the government. I've also more or less left aside operating costs and personnel requirements, mainly because if we're matching election commitments, then we might as well just do what Peter Dutton did and let the future be the future's problem. I haven't ranked any of the ideas since I think that any or all of these would actually be worth doing if the budget weren't a problem, but I have split them into two groups. First, the quote-unquote boring stuff, the critical but non-flashy jobs, often relatively easy to implement if money is made available, the kinds of things that will make a difference to the ADF and the security of the nation generally, but which might not have that much of an impact on the election. Then at the back, I've grouped the kind of things that make for good press conferences, new capabilities, big ships, big job programs, that sort of thing. So, without any further ado, let's get started. Number 1. Accelerate and expand northern infrastructure plans. Australia's north is our most important region when it comes to forward force projection, but it's also going to be our defensive front line if anyone ever tries to attack us. Bases such as Darwin and Tyndall and the Bear bases at Sherga, Learmonth and Curtin would be enormously valuable, but equally vulnerable to attack. While some work has already started to upgrade some of these bases and a significant amount has been allocated in the long term, relatively little attention has been paid to defences against long-range strikes. The government could commit cash to hardening these bases, initially through simple things like building resistant aircraft shelters or increasing the stockpiles of basic building materials to rapidly repair runways, implementing anti-drone defences like those pioneered in Ukraine, or strengthening communications infrastructure, or even considering burying command and control assets. Later, more complex and expensive options, such as the purchase of additional air defense systems like NASAMS, could also be considered, but that's probably better off in the longer term. Number 2. Bring our strategic petroleum reserve onshore. At any given time, Australia holds roughly 60 days worth of petroleum products, which is substantially below the minimum 90 days required by the IEA. A few years ago, the Morrison government decided that one way to address Australia's chronic supply shortages would be to buy up a large crude oil reserve, which it then chose to store in the United States. Now, the issues with that idea should be fairly obvious to anyone, but the truth is, Australia's ability to refine crude oil is vastly below its demands for refined products, and even an onshore crude oil stockpile would be less useful than an onshore diesel stockpile, which Australia consumes in significant quantities, over 160 million litres of diesel per day. Now, in fairness, the Albanese government has moved to try to address this issue. Last year, they tightened up regulations on businesses and required fuel importers to hold larger stockpiles, but despite that, at the start of 2025, we had just 22 days of supply available onshore. Defence's own plans in this area, the Defence Fuel Resilience Programs, or DEF 8191, has had less than $300 million allocated to it over 5 years. $3 billion, however, would go a long way towards alleviating that shortage. The American military, for example, just built a 300 million litre storage facility for jet fuel in Darwin for $270 million. If we round everything off, we could build 10 of those distributed around the country, giving us an additional 20 days of onshore supply. Or we could build half that many and use the leftover money to fill them up and keep the logistics going to cycle fresh diesel through them. Either way, it would massively improve Australia's fuel security and resistance to blockading. Number 3. Build up domestic shipyard capacity. This one is, I'll admit, a bit out there, but I think it's worth considering. Australia currently only has 4 large-scale operating shipyards in the entire country, those being the Osborne shipyards in Adelaide, the CivMec yards in Henderson, the Austell yards also at Henderson, and the INCAP facility in Tasmania. Given that CivMech and Osborne are fully committed for the foreseeable future, and Austal at Henderson are building Guardian and Evolved Cape class patrol boats, the only potential spare capacity is either by pausing those low priority builds at Austal or by undertaking military procurement at INCAT. Government investment, however, could potentially change that reality. Probably in exchange for an equity stake of some kind, government could consider funding expansions by existing shipbuilders to grow their capacity. This might include, for example, returning CivMech's Forgax docks in Newcastle to its former glory as a fully capable shipbuilding facility rather than merely a support facility for builds in WA, or potentially expanding Burdon's Port Macquarie facility, which is quite capable but physically small, or refurbishing NQEA's facility in Cairns so that they can undertake defence shipbuilding again for the RAN, as they did as recently as the year 2000 with HMAS Lewin and Melville. One particularly interesting company in this space is Austal. Recently, it was announced that Korean company Hanwha had purchased 9.9% of that shipbuilder and subsequently applied to the Foreign Investment Review Board, or FIRB, to increase their ownership stake to 19.9%, just below the 20% threshold that triggers takeover provisions on the ASX. This is typically what companies do when they intend to undertake a takeover, particularly a hostile one, or if they just want to put their foot on a company and prevent anyone else from taking it over. Hanwha tried a friendlier takeover in 2024, but were ultimately rejected by Austal's board, in part because they believed that FIRB wouldn't allow the transaction to go forward. But despite that, it seems pretty clear that Hanwha have not given up on their ambition to own Austal. While the Australian government typically don't get involved with foreign direct investment of this particular sort, they do have the option to block it, and a sovereign shipbuilder is the kind of thing that they might choose to protect through FIRB. An alternate plan, however, might be to involve themselves quite directly in the negotiation, make FIRB approval contingent on some degree of government involvement. The federal government could commit some capital to purchase some kind of equity stake to ensure Australian sovereign control of Austal isn't entirely wiped out. And they could, as part of the preconditions for any approval, require Hanwha to use that capital injection to expand Austal's output capacity in a sort of public-private partnership. Upgrading and expanding Henderson would be a good start, but the big prize might be the former Cairncross dock in Brisbane, which is located literally next door to a small but active Austal facility. While the actual shipyard there is long gone and the land has been rezoned, it's not yet been built on. So a new facility could theoretically be built there with enough government support, though perhaps not quickly enough to be enormously valuable in the very short term. Regardless of whether it's through Hanwha and Austal or a different company, these new or upgraded yards wouldn't necessarily need to be the equal of the highly sophisticated, cutting-edge and very much larger shipyards at Osborne. But even as second-tier facilities, they would provide Australia with substantial surge capacity in case it found itself in need of a substantial domestic build-out of small but capable vessels, a concept I've previously explored in my Modern Bathurst video. Like I said, this one's a little out there. The costs could end up being significantly above the $3 billion threshold, and there are definitely going to be challenges, not least that the investment is probably hard to justify without guaranteed work to follow on from the build-up. But if we want spare surge capacity in naval shipbuilding, something I think we are at serious risk of needing in the next few years, there's really no other way to get it. And if we've learned anything from Ukraine and similar conflicts, it should be that hyper-efficient, just-in-time style logistics built around minimum viable capacity are insufficient when you actually find yourself fighting a war. We might well be past the point where we can prioritize efficiency over all else, and the time to spend some money to reintroduce some fat into the system may well have come. Number 4. Establish a domestic SAM program alongside GWEO. One other thing that Ukraine's war against Russia has shown is the importance of strong air defences, especially when air supremacy is not available, as it likely won't be in any future war in the Western Pacific. The weakest link in the air defence chain, however, isn't lack of launchers, radars, or even trained personnel. It's the actual interceptors, the missiles themselves, the lack of which can see the batteries fall silent all too quickly. A naval war would likely be very similar, with exquisite missile defences on board modern surface combatants really only as good for as long as their Mark 41 VLS cells remain filled. But Australia currently doesn't build any such interceptors, nor are there currently any plans to change that under the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise, or GWEO. That said, $3 billion is a lot of money. In fact, the 2024 GWEO report outlined only $3.6 billion spent on domestic manufacturing capability and enterprise enablers, suggesting that $3 billion could potentially be enough to build a complementary sub-project for surface-to-air missiles. If the government were open to taking on a degree of risk, they could establish that sub-project using the moonshot methodology, where groups would be encouraged to develop a proposal to meet specific criteria. Say a Mark 41 and NASAMS compatible missile with a given range, cost and accuracy comparable to, say, the ESSM, but critically with a scalable domestic production capacity. The most promising groups could receive limited initial seed funding from the government to advance their best ideas, but ultimately the incentive would be for private money to be invested, chasing a substantial cash prize for the winner, along with a large initial contract, perhaps for several hundred missiles. The process could then be repeated for more advanced missiles, say a domestic alternative to the SM-2. Alternatively, the government might choose a lower risk pathway and could try to form a partnership with an established munitions manufacturer, maybe South Korea's Hanwha Aerospace, to try to rapidly adapt something already in production, like the KM-SAM for Australia's ships and launchers, and then to establish onshore facilities to build the missiles. Number 5. Establish a more permanent surface naval presence at Exmouth. Exmouth in Western Australia is already a military town, with both the Learmonth Bear Base and the US-Australian Harold E. Holt Naval Communications Station being located in or near the town. However, the Surface Navy has very little presence there, only stopping occasionally to refuel, despite very favourable geography. Exmouth is ideally located to refuel vessels travelling between Western Australia and India or the Middle East, a route which would very likely become very important if we lost access to current key trading partners, particularly those selling us refined fuel during some kind of conflict in East or Southeast Asia. Exmouth also has the benefit of being outside the range of most of China's non-strategic weapons, and has the established naval pier there to support the communications base. It's also well positioned to cover the economically important trade which happens out of the Pilbara and the Northwest Shelf. While admittedly much of that would shut down in a wartime scenario if for some reason we didn't want to trade with China anymore, or if we couldn't safely reach customers in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, or Southeast Asia. But things like concentrate and natural gas production for the Australian domestic market would be even more important than ever, and keeping those operations safe would be an important job for an expanded RAN. Finally, with our support ships out of action, the need to establish additional resupply bases around the country has been put into pretty sharp focus. With the limited number of ships we have, supported by an even smaller number of support assets, we can't afford to waste too much time with our ships steaming back and forth to distant ports to undertake basic resupply. Unfortunately, a parliamentary report in 2023 highlighted that the facilities that already exist there, the naval pier and associated refueling equipment, were in what the report called a seriously disturbing state of disrepair, though recent media reports suggest that efforts to fix some of these issues have since started. Fixing them up while also expanding the onshore presence, perhaps adding weapon storage, more personnel, basic repair capabilities, that sort of thing, would allow the Navy to fill a significant gap on the west coast and wouldn't go astray as a potential vote winner here in Western Australia, where the Premier recently urged the government to station more surface ships on the west coast. Perhaps the one major downside, apart from logistical issues like water supply that could probably be sorted out with $3 billion to play with, is that the Naval Communications Station in Exmouth is likely one of a fairly small number of priority nuclear targets in Australia. In the event of a full-on strategic exchange, the base would be at risk, but so too would be just about any major military base. So while some consideration might be given to spreading certain facilities out a little bit, this probably isn't enough to kill the concept entirely. So those are 5 less flashy ideas, some of which I think could be reasonably attractive to a government in election mode, especially where direct jobs are likely to be created building and upgrading ADF facilities or at government-run or supported shipyards. But while that kind of back-end stuff is absolutely essential to keeping the ADF running, if the government really wants to grab public attention, then it's going to need to commit to some new kit. Fortunately, there are a few better options out there than another squadron of F-35s. Number 6. Acquire the UK's excess MESA Radars and build 2 more Wedgetails. The E-7 Wedgetail Airborne Early Warning and Control aircraft was custom designed for the RAAF, and today, in 2025, Australia operates the world's largest fleet of the type, with 6 in inventory. They have performed admirably, earning international orders from all around the world. Normally, aircraft like this take a long time to build, and wouldn't be the kind of thing that you typically associate with speed to capability, but times are unique. The UK in 2018 ordered 5 of the aircraft, only to reduce that order to 3 in 2021. But they remained contractually on the hook for all 5 of the MESA radars that adorn the spine of the aircraft, and which make it so potent. And those radars are about to be delivered here in 2025. These are the most complex and longest lead time component of the aircraft, and the UK is about to have 2 of them just sitting around spare. Australia should consider buying those radars and immediately getting Boeing Australia to begin conversion of 2 more existing aircraft into E-7s. Acquiring these additional Wedgetails would give Australia slack in the fleet to allow it to contribute these enormously valuable aircraft to international operations. Consider Ukraine. Anthony Albanese has said that Australia is open to committing troops to a peacekeeping operation in the event of a ceasefire, but any Australian boots on the ground would require a logistical train stretching back thousands of kilometres to Australia, a vastly more expensive exercise than supplying a similar number of troops from a few hundred kilometres away in Poland, or even a couple of thousand or so kilometres away in France or the UK. It's simply not cost efficient. But Australia could provide an E-7 or a pair of E-7s to allow for far more regular and consistent air coverage with a much lighter logistical load, especially given the aircraft's roots as a commercial airliner that could probably be serviced more or less anywhere in the world where there's a commercial airport. And This kind of capability is only becoming more important as America begins to pull back from its international commitments, threatening to take much of its enormous and more or less irreplaceable ISR and intelligence capability right along with it. Even as we find ourselves in a more and more dangerous region, Australia is a global nation and shouldn't be content to retreat into its shell. More aircraft like the E-7 would offer us a very efficient means to contribute increasingly critical and hard to come by enablers to global efforts without necessarily putting our people on the ground. Number 7. Go hard on drone and anti-drone warfare. As I mentioned in the previous section, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been talking very seriously over the last few weeks about potentially putting boots on the ground in Ukraine under the umbrella of a broader European-led peacekeeping force in the event of a ceasefire being signed. Personally, I'm in favour of Australia helping in that area, though I would rather see us commit fewer troops on the ground and more expensive high-end enablers like strategic airlift or E-7s. But if we are going to put troops into harm's way, then we need to remember that Putin's Russia has broken just about every ceasefire they have ever signed, and recognize that what we're signing up for here is almost certainly at least intermittent combat. And if that's the case, then Australia needs to get serious about drones, and we need to do it now, as in the coming weeks and months, not the coming years. Step 1 needs to be defensive. Domestic systems like EOS's Slinger have been proven in Ukraine, and acquisition of these should be prioritized, along with enablers like CEA Technologies' Hawkeye-mounted SeaTac radars, which, assuming the systems can be made to talk to each other, would likely be a pretty potent combination. Electronic warfare and other soft kill systems also need to be acquired, ideally in very close coordination with the Ukrainians to ensure that they're at the cutting edge of capability. After that, small-scale recon drones probably need to be the next priority, though fortunately the ADF has already dipped a toe into this area, similarly with loitering munitions like the OWL. Kamikaze FPVs might at this stage be better left to the Ukrainians themselves, who can acquire and operate these systems far more efficiently than Australia can, though in the longer term, expansion of this capability for Army seems inevitable. In fact, one of the biggest advantages to deploying troops on the ground in Ukraine would probably be material advancement in this area, simply from learning from the Ukrainians, who more or less have to be the best in the world right now. At the very highest end of the drone pecking order, Australia currently has no large armed drones, though we are building several different types at different scales and levels of sophistication. The utility of these types of assets in Ukraine specifically may be limited, given the extreme level of air denial through ground-based air defenses, but as a capability for the ADF more broadly, I think they're undeniably useful. I did a video recently talking about the value that the MQ-9B Sea Guardian could offer Australia, so I won't go into great detail, but to summarise, the MQ-9B has plenty of peacetime value in maritime domain awareness and search and rescue, but even more wartime utility, providing organic air cover when operating in its short takeoff configuration from our LHDs, and most important of all, acting as a spotter for long-range missile shots. I stand by most of that video, but as several people mentioned in the comments, it was written before the Americans went quite as crazy as they have recently, and it's probably going to be pretty hard to politically justify sending billions of dollars offshore to America at the moment. However, with Chinese warships circling around Australia, the ability to shoot back will be seen as likely politically very palatable, even despite the America factor, and it's really hard to shoot back if you can't see them. A potential alternative to the MQ-9B would be BAE's Strix VTOL drone, but unfortunately Strix is still very much in its developmental stages, and is likely at least a few years away from being ready to deploy, and even further away from being able to deploy with comparable capabilities to the MQ-9B, especially in areas like electronic warfare. At this stage, I think an acquisition of a small fleet of Sea Guardians is justifiable as part of a broader package of drone and anti-drone capabilities. $1.3 billion was allocated to buy a dozen MQ-9s before the program was scrapped in 2022, including the wing kits, sensors, pods, and weapons that they would need. That same value might only get you 8 today once you account for inflation, but that would probably be close to enough, with the rest of the $3 billion we're playing with here being available to rapidly acquire the kinds of capabilities that our ground forces would need in Ukraine. Number 8. Double dip on maritime strike. The government is currently in the selection phase of Project Land 4100, Phase 2, Land-Based Maritime Strike, which is choosing between the US HIMARS and the Precision Strike Missile, or the domestic Strike Master equipped with a naval strike missile. There are strong arguments in favour of both. Strike Master is domestic and sovereign, but HIMARS has longer range, though range is often limited more by targeting assets than by the missile itself, so that benefit is somewhat mitigated. Both types, however, will be equipped with missiles that will ultimately be produced domestically, so if there was an appetite, the government could take a chunk of the $3 billion and simply order both. This would obviously dovetail nicely with the previous point about long endurance drones, setting up a sort of a full shooter sensor package deal. Land-based maritime strike is not a capability Australia is ever going to cease to need, and we already operate both HIMARS and the Bushmaster, or at least have plans to, so neither would add a particularly substantial burden to existing logistical backends. So this is a rare example of something where duplicating capacity shouldn't actually add an undue back-end burden. Of course, as with most of the proposals in here to buy additional kit, people to actually use it become more of an issue, though potentially you could resolve that partially by making both systems available to the new Long-Range Fires Regiment authorised under Project Land 8113 Phase 2, but keep the additional units as spare capacity, either to replace attrition in the event of a conflict or to stand up a third regiment in the event that we faced a real short-term threat. Number 9. Establish a light warship fleet. If the Chinese flotilla incident has shown anything, it's shown this. The RAN is too small. I think everyone has more or less known that for a while now, but nothing has put a finer point on it than facing the need to shadow a fleet doing a circuit around our own continent and realizing that we only just barely had enough vessels to actually do it, and even then only with help from the Kiwis. With the number of surface combatants not getting above 10 for the next decade or more, even with C3000, we need to change something here, and we need to do it faster and cheaper than we're doing with a general purpose frigate. Again, much like the MQ-9B, I have a video on this topic, and anyone who wants the full details on what I personally would like to see can go back and look at my modern Bathurst concept. But to very quickly recap, personally, I'd like to see an ASW-focused aluminium catamaran-hulled ship with a helicopter hangar and a relatively light, mainly gun-based armament, which could be built at Austal and possibly INCAT for less than about $400 million a pop. As a few people pointed out in the comments to that video, Austal already have their Manta concept, which is somewhat similar, or at the very least falls broadly into the same class. Personally, I don't really think Manta precisely fits what Australia needs, but it certainly does have some advantages. Number one, it's small enough that it can be built readily in all of Austal's existing bays at Henderson, and it's crewed with just 20 or 30 people. Number two, I like the use of loitering munition launchers instead of Hellfires to defend against small boats, and I think that the combination of RIM 116 CRAM, mass decoy, and 35mm autocannon gives it pretty decent anti-air capabilities, though the CRAM is pricey. Its downsides, though, are pretty serious. Its small size is a two-edged sword, making it easier to produce, but limiting it to relatively short ranges of less than 2,700 nautical miles and cutting its available deadweight capacity. It also means it doesn't have a helicopter hangar, meaning the ship has no real anti-submarine capabilities except possibly in containerized systems, which would be competing with the only place to put anti-ship cruise missiles with none built in. A big issue, though, is the radar. While the full-fat CFAR-2 radar that the ship is equipped with is an excellent sensor, it's a very heavy and powerful system, likely too much radar for the ship given the inherent deadweight limitations of a catamaran hull and the lack of any long-range, high-potency anti-air armament that would justify this kind of sensor. So it's very much a mixed bag, and if my opinion counted for anything, I'd still be pushing for something based on the HSSV 113. But on the other hand, if Austal could start building Mantas tomorrow, I'm sure Navy could find a use for them. They're likely far better than nothing. Now, obviously, those two aren't the only options. There are all sorts of fast attack craft and corvettes out there, and if we decided we didn't necessarily have to build them onshore, we could potentially get some built very quickly in South Korea or Europe. Though events might be about to overtake us there. As Europe looks to boost its own defences, spare shipyard capacity might be about to dry up. Regardless of exactly how we might choose to build up a small warship fleet, the idea obviously has some serious challenges. Buying the ships probably means we don't have the spare cash to build up the shipyard infrastructure that I spoke about earlier. So, assuming an onshore build, they would probably need to be built exclusively at Austal's existing facilities, which are technically committed to the Guardian and Evolved Cape programs, and already strained for workforce, limiting their ability to add new ships. As for that matter is the ADF generally, and new ships, even more so than several of the other capabilities I've discussed so far, will need a pretty serious workforce boost, not just to design them and build them, but also to crew them. Potentially, they could partially displace some existing patrol boats, which might free up some personnel, but it will still be an enormous challenge. But I think recent events have made it clear that we need some sort of program to get hulls in the water, a stopgap solution that really only has to see us through the next 10 years or so until the major surface combatant numbers start to rise up again, if only to have something armed and regularly available to take on the role of shadowing Chinese or other hostile task groups, which China have made clear are going to be regular visitors to our part of the world in the coming years. Finally on this topic, the time now has also very clearly come to do something about the Arafura program. It's the RAN's red-headed stepchild, undergunned, underbuilt, and just not fit for purpose. They either need to be formally repurposed into a specialist role like mine warfare, or we need to bite the bullet, accept that mistakes have been made, and sink the cash necessary to arm them and upgrade them at least back to something approaching the standards of the Darussalam class that they were derived from. Now, I am aware that they have been modified, that the structural reinforcement has been taken out of the design, that there are limitations in the platform that didn't exist in their parent design. But we have a significant chunk of $3 billion to play with here. If they can't be fixed with that amount of money, especially with most of the fleet not even in the water yet, then something is deeply rotten in Australian shipbuilding. Number 10. Reactivate Project C-2200. Project C-2200 was a casualty of the Defence Strategic Review and was initially slated to deliver a pair of 16,500-ton joint support ships, which would have been capable of amphibious logistics and sea lift, as well as at-sea replenishment. In some ways, I can understand the logic of the decision not to acquire the ships. Australia has two supply class AORs, which support our fleet of roughly 10 major surface combatants and 2 amphibs. While the composition and capability of that fleet is going to change over the coming years, it's not going to grow meaningfully for over a decade. Our at-sea replenishment needs should be, theoretically, met for some time yet. But that was before the Chinese began operating in our immediate region, demanding the ability for the fleet to maintain long-term at-sea operations at short notice in order to shadow them, and before we found ourselves forced to question the reliability of the US alliance, and before both of our AORs got taken out of operation thanks to dodgy build quality. The situation has changed, and we need to change with it. Fortunately, we can look across the ditch for some ideas about how we can change. The Kiwis ordered HMNZS Aotearoa in 2016 from HHI in Korea, and had it commissioned 4 years later at a cost of 495 million New Zealand dollars. Adjusted for inflation and converted, that's about 580 million Australian today. Aotearoa is quite a bit larger than Project SEA 2200 envisioned, so we can maybe consider that an upper limit for cost. But it seems very likely that a pair of support ships built in Korea to an existing design should be able to be acquired for well under 2 billion, the same rough cost as the supply class. Potentially, we might be able to get an even better deal if we're willing to be a bit flexible and adopt the Korean Soyang class fast combat support ship. This is a lighter ship, displacing only around 10,000 tons empty, but it's also one which Hanwha is about to start construction on for South Korea, and one which we could potentially piggyback off to save quite a bit of cash. So there we go. 10 ideas, some better than others, but all of them, in my opinion at least, better than spending $3 billion or more on fighter jets from the US that we won't see until 2030 at the earliest. I don't expect many or even any of these ideas to be necessarily picked up by either side of politics, and I'm sure that there are holes to be picked in most of them. I mean, none of these are any less policy on the run than Dutton's F-35 thought bubble. But specifics aside, there is a theme in there that I hope does define the government's approach to defence acquisitions over the next 2 or 3 years. That being to embrace risk, pick some winners, and, where possible, make them Australian domestic winners. The ADF has an extreme aversion to risk-taking in acquisitions. In many ways, that's admirable, especially in peacetime. These acquisitions are huge and expensive investments of public money. Any government owes its taxpayers a degree of due diligence when considering them. But there comes a point where this goes overboard, where due diligence morphs into paralysis. Simple seeming decisions take years, and even then, even after all that work and study, often end up being not just wrong, but catastrophic. Take the Arafura class OPV, the first of which was just delivered to Navy in 2025, and which came out originally of the 2009 Defence White Paper. That means it took 16 years to design and deliver a single 1,600-ton OPV which, as of today, is functionally unarmed and can't handle a helicopter. Even in projects like C3000, which is supposed to be all about speed to delivery of a general-purpose frigate, the Defense Department told Senate estimates that it expects to not make a decision until the first quarter of 2026, roughly 12 months after receiving the shipyard's final submissions in Q1 of 2025. I realize that the decision is a big one, but once the choice has been made to spend the money, there really are no truly bad choices left in that competition. The risk is very low that we will receive a lemon, so why do we need to spend a year going back and forth? Now, contrast that process against the Super Hornet acquisition, which was a decision essentially out of nowhere in 2006, a captain's call by the minister of the day that was criticised at the time as being an election year fix for the Howard government, without sufficient consideration given to alternatives. And what happened? It turned into one of our most successful recent military acquisitions. So successful, in fact, that a complementary fleet of Growler EW variants were bought 10 years later, and in 2024, the fleet had its life extended by the DSR. So, while I'm not advocating reckless decision making or pulling all the guardrails off and leaving the door open for corruption and other graft, I do think that the government needs to embrace risk, especially when ordering military off the shelf from domestic suppliers. Find a capability gap, find a supplier that will more or less fill that gap with an off the shelf or very minimally modified design, allocate a certain amount of money, and set the project running. Certainly, keep an eye on it, and don't be afraid to pull funding if it's going off the rails, but as long as the underlying product is solid and nobody meddles too much, odds are good that you'll achieve at least an 80% solution, and in our current strategic circumstances, that's probably going to have to be good enough. The government could do much, much worse than simply picking some flagship domestic projects to throw money at. Whether that's developmental projects like Austal's Manta, BAE's Strix, or C2 Robotics Speartooth, or combat-proven off-the-shelf systems like EOS's Slinger anti-drone system or SIPAC's cardboard drones, there are plenty of places we could put that $3 billion to offer large, long-term contracts, giving Australian industry the confidence to invest in the manufacturing scale that will ultimately do much, much more for us than some F-35s off in the never never.